Imagine standing 20,000 years ago on a hillside overlooking a fertile valley. You're part of a small group, maybe 30 people total. Your family, your tribe. You know every single person by name, by laugh, by the way they walk. You're looking down at wild wheat growing thick and golden in the valley below, swaying in the wind. You don't know it yet, but you're standing at the edge of the greatest transformation in human history. A transformation so profound it would reshape everything. Our bodies, our minds, our societies, the entire planet itself. You're about to make a choice that will echo through the next 10,000 years. A choice that will lead to cities and civilization, to art and architecture, to everything we call progress. But here's the thing nobody tells you in history class. That choice might have been the biggest mistake humanity ever made. Today we're going to explore one of the most controversial ideas in anthropology. The agricultural revolution, the moment humans stopped hunting and gathering and started farming, might not have been humanity's triumph. It might have been our downfall. And the evidence for this is absolutely shocking. See, there's this idea we all grow up with. It's baked into every history textbook, every documentary, every story we tell ourselves about human progress. It goes like this. Our ancestors were struggling hunter-gatherers, barely surviving, constantly hungry, living short, brutal lives. Then we discovered farming. We planted seeds. We domesticated animals. And suddenly everything got better. We had more food, more security, more time to invent things and create culture. Farming made us civilized. Farming made us human. Farming saved us. Except it's not true. Not even close. When anthropologists and archaeologists actually looked at the evidence, when they compared the skeletons of pre-agricultural humans with early farmers, when they analyzed their teeth and bones and the marks of disease and malnutrition, they found something nobody expected. Farming made us sicker. It made us shorter. It made us die younger. It gave us diseases we'd never had before. It chained us to endless labor. It created inequality and warfare and systematic oppression. Early farmers lived harder, more miserable lives than the hunter-gatherers who came before them. And yet, once we started farming, we couldn't stop. We couldn't go back. It spread across the entire world like a slow-motion revolution, transforming every human society it touched. Why? Why would humans voluntarily adopt a lifestyle that made them worse off? That's the mystery we're going to unravel tonight. If you're listening to this to fall asleep, perfect. That's exactly why I make these. So maybe hit subscribe and tell me in the comments where are you right now and what time is it? I love seeing that it's midnight in Manchester, morning in Melbourne, bedtime in Baltimore, all at once. Now, here's what makes this story so fascinating. We have this idea that history moves in one direction. Progress. Things get better over time. We evolve, we improve, we advance. But the agricultural revolution shows us something different. Sometimes progress is a trap. Sometimes what looks like advancement is actually a step backward. And sometimes, by the time you realize you've made a mistake, you're in too deep to reverse it. Over the next few hours, we're going to walk through this transformation step by step. We'll start in the world before farming, with hunter-gatherers who lived lives that might surprise you. Lives that were healthier, freer, and in many ways richer than what came after. We'll watch as farming slowly, almost accidentally emerges in different parts of the world. We'll see how it spread, not because it was better, but because it was unstoppable. We'll examine the physical toll it took on human bodies, the diseases it unleashed, the social hierarchies it created, the way it trapped humans in cycles of endless labor. But we'll also explore the other side, Because farming did give us something. Cities and writing, art and science, the entire foundation of modern civilization. The question isn't whether farming was all good or all bad. The question is whether the trade-off was worth it, and whether we even had a choice. 20,000 years ago, humans stood at a crossroads. The path we chose led to everything we have today. But it also led to suffering on a scale our ancestors couldn't have imagined. This is the story of humanity's greatest transformation, the mystery of how farming made us, and the question of whether it was the greatest mistake we ever made. Let's go back, way back, to a world before fields and farms, before cities and kings, to a time when humans lived as we'd lived for hundreds of thousands of years, as hunter-gatherers. And let me tell you, it wasn't what you think. So let's go back, way back, 20,000 years ago, before cities, before farms, before permanent settlements of any kind. Back to a time when every human on Earth lived the way our ancestors had lived for hundreds of thousands of years, as hunter-gatherers, as foragers moving through landscapes that would seem impossibly wild to us today. Picture yourself waking up in this world, not in a house, not even in a permanent camp, but in a temporary shelter, maybe a lean-to made of branches and animal hides, positioned near a reliable water source. The sun is just coming up. Around you, maybe 25 other people are stirring. Your band, your family in the broadest sense. Some are related by blood, others by marriage, but you've known most of them your entire life. Here's the first thing that would surprise you about this morning. You're not immediately scrambling to find food. You're not desperate or starving. In fact, your band has plenty to eat. Yesterday, a few of the adults brought back a young deer. There's still meat left, carefully stored in a cool spot, covered with leaves. Someone else gathered a massive haul of nuts 3 days ago. They're stored in leather bags, enough to last another week at least. The women who went to the river yesterday came back with baskets full of freshwater mussels and edible roots. This is the dirty secret about hunter-gatherer life that agriculture's origin story never wants to admit. For most of human history, in most environments, foraging provided reliable, abundant, diverse nutrition with remarkably little effort. We've been sold this narrative of desperate, starving hunter-gatherers barely surviving, constantly on the edge of starvation. But the archaeological and ethnographic evidence tells a completely different story. Studies of modern hunter-gatherer societies, the few that survived into the 20th century before being destroyed or absorbed by agricultural civilizations, paint a picture that would shock most people. The Kungsan of the Kalahari Desert, living in one of the harshest environments on Earth, worked an average of 12 to 19 hours per week obtaining food. The Hadza of Tanzania, about 17 hours per week. Australian Aboriginal groups, 15 to 20 hours. That's not per day, that's per week. Total food acquisition time. Compare that to agricultural societies where farmers routinely worked 12 to 14 hours a day, dawn to dusk, 6 or 7 days a week, with brief respites only during winter months. Hunter-gatherers were, by any reasonable measure, working part-time and eating better than most farmers would for the next 10,000 years. So what did they eat? Everything. That's the second revelation about foraging life. The dietary diversity was staggering. In a single week, a hunter-gatherer band might consume 40 or 50 different plant species, nuts, berries, roots, tubers, seeds, shoots, leaves, flowers. They knew which plants were edible in each season, where to find them, how to process them. Some required elaborate preparation. Certain roots had to be roasted for hours to break down toxins. Some nuts needed to be leached in running water before they were safe to eat. Others could be eaten raw right off the tree. Then there was animal protein. And here's where the variety gets really impressive. Yes, they hunted large game when opportunities arose. Deer, wild pigs, occasionally larger animals like aurochs, the wild ancestors of modern cattle. But they didn't depend on big game. They couldn't. Large animals were too unpredictable, too dangerous, too much effort for uncertain returns. Instead, they were opportunistic omnivores of the highest order. They caught fish, trapped birds, collected eggs, dug up grubs and insects, harvested freshwater shellfish, hunted small mammals like rabbits and hares. Archaeological sites from this period show the bones of dozens of different animal species, evidence of people who ate whatever was available and knew how to get it. This dietary diversity wasn't just about variety for its own sake. It was about nutrition. Modern analysis of hunter-gatherer diets shows they consumed more protein, more vitamins, more minerals, and more dietary fiber than the average person in agricultural societies. They weren't dealing with the vitamin deficiencies that would plague farmers who ate mostly grain. They weren't suffering the protein shortages that would stunt the growth of later agricultural populations. The skeletal evidence backs this up in ways that are almost shocking. When archaeologists examined human remains from the Paleolithic period, from before the agricultural revolution, they find people who were tall, robust, with strong bone density and healthy teeth. The average height of men in hunter-gatherer populations was around 5'9" or 5'10", about the same as modern Europeans. Women averaged around 5'5" or 5'6". Then agriculture arrives, and within a few generations, average heights plummet. Early farmers in the Middle East were 4 to 6 inches shorter than their foraging ancestors. The same pattern appears everywhere farming is adopted. China, Europe, the Americas. People get shorter, bone density decreases, dental health deteriorates. Markers of disease and malnutrition increase dramatically. But let's get back to that morning 20,000 years ago. You've woken up, your band has plenty of food, and today you need to decide what to do. And here's another surprise. You get to decide. There's no boss, no chief who can order you around. Hunter-gatherer bands were radically egalitarian in ways that would seem almost utopian to later agricultural societies. Anthropologists who studied surviving hunter-gatherer groups in the 20th century were consistently struck by how equal these societies were. Not just economically equal. Everyone shared food, nobody accumulated significant property, but politically equal. Decisions were made by consensus. Yes, some individuals had more influence because of their skills or knowledge, the best tracker, the most knowledgeable plant expert, the most charismatic storyteller. But they couldn't coerce anyone. They couldn't force others to obey them. If someone tried to dominate, tried to act like a chief or boss, the rest of the band would simply leave. And they could leave because they weren't tied to any particular place. This is maybe the most fundamental difference between hunter-gatherer life and everything that came after. Mobility equals freedom. Your band doesn't own land. The concept wouldn't make sense to you. You have traditional territories, places you know intimately, where your parents and grandparents foraged. You have relationships with neighboring bands, complex agreements about who can access which resources when. But you don't own any of it. You can't sell it, can't fence it off, can't exclude others from it absolutely. This means several things. First, it means you're incredibly free to move. If resources in one area become scarce, you move to another area. If social tensions in your band become unbearable, you can split off with a few families and join a different band. If someone tries to dominate or bully you, you can walk away. Second, It means accumulating possessions is pointless. Everything you own, you have to carry. This creates a natural limit on material inequality. Sure, some people might have nicer clothing or better tools, but nobody can accumulate vast wealth because there's nowhere to store it and no way to transport it. Third, and perhaps most importantly, it means the band depends on cooperation. You can't have a permanent underclass because the underclass would just leave. You can't have slavery because slaves would run away. You can't have extreme gender inequality because women could, and did, form their own bands or join other groups if treated too poorly. The ethnographic record shows that hunter-gatherer societies had remarkably egalitarian gender relations compared to most agricultural societies. Yes, there was a division of labor. Men typically did more hunting of large game. Women typically did more gathering and small game hunting. But this wasn't a hard rule, and it didn't translate into political or social inequality. Women in foraging bands controlled the distribution of the plant foods they gathered, which usually constituted 60 to 80% of the band's total caloric intake. That's not an economic detail, that's power. If you control most of the food, you have a voice in decisions. Archaeological evidence suggests women participated equally in ritual and spiritual life. Some of the most elaborate prehistoric burials are of women, buried with the same grave goods and honors as men. This is the world your ancestors inhabited. Not a paradise, not some noble, savage fantasy where everything was perfect, but a life with a kind of freedom and equality that most humans wouldn't experience again for thousands of years. But let's talk about what this life actually required, because here's where we start to understand why it eventually gave way to farming. Being a successful hunter-gatherer required an absolutely staggering amount of knowledge and skill. You needed to know hundreds of plant species by sight, understand their seasonal cycles, remember where specific groves or patches were located, sometimes miles away. You needed to know which plants were edible, which were medicinal, which were poisonous, and which could be made edible through proper processing. You needed to track animals, understand their behavior patterns, predict where they'd be at different times of day and year. You needed to know how to make and maintain dozens of different tools, each specialized for specific tasks. How to knap stone into sharp cutting edges. How to attach those edges to wooden handles. How to make cordage from plant fibers. How to tan leather. How to weave baskets. You needed to navigate across vast distances without maps or compasses, using landmarks, stars, and accumulated mental maps passed down through generations. You needed to predict weather patterns, find water in dry seasons, identify safe camping spots that wouldn't flood or attract predators. This knowledge wasn't simple. It couldn't be learned from a book because there were no books. It had to be acquired over years of patient observation and practice, transmitted orally from skilled practitioners to learners. Every person in the band needed a substantial portion of this knowledge to survive, and all of it was specific to local environments. Move 500 miles away and you'd need to learn a completely new set of plants, animals, and seasonal patterns. This created what anthropologists call immediate return economics. You worked to get food, you got food, you ate it. There was little storage, little surplus, little planning more than a few days or weeks ahead. When food was abundant, you ate well and worked less. When food was scarce, you worked harder and ate less well. But crucially, you only had to support the people actually in your band. Population density was incredibly low. Maybe one person per square mile, sometimes less. This wasn't because people couldn't reproduce more quickly. It was because the environment couldn't support more people living as foragers. Women in hunter-gatherer societies typically spaced births 3 to 4 years apart, much longer than in agricultural societies. This spacing wasn't accidental. It was managed through extended breastfeeding, which suppresses ovulation, and probably through herbal contraceptives and occasional infanticide. Harsh realities of a world where you had to carry young children everywhere you went. You couldn't have a new infant every year when you were still carrying a 2-year-old on long foraging expeditions. But here's what that low population density gave you: no epidemic diseases. This is huge. The diseases that would ravage agricultural civilizations, smallpox, measles, typhus, cholera, plague, none of them existed yet. They couldn't exist. These diseases require large, dense populations to sustain transmission chains. A measles outbreak in a band of 25 people would either kill everyone or burn out in a few weeks when survivors developed immunity. Hunter-gatherers had parasites. Absolutely. They had injuries, infections, the occasional outbreak of food poisoning or waterborne illness. But they didn't have the devastating epidemics that would kill millions in later civilizations. The archaeological record shows it. Paleolithic skeletons don't show the markers of epidemic disease that become common in agricultural populations. So there you are, 20,000 years ago. You're healthy, well-fed, living in a small egalitarian band. You work maybe 15 to 20 hours a week to obtain food, leaving plenty of time for socializing, storytelling, ritual, art, play. You're free to move, free to leave if social relationships become unbearable. You eat a diverse diet of dozens of different foods. You possess deep knowledge about the natural world around you. You live with a kind of intimacy with nature that we can barely imagine today. Why would anyone ever give this up? Why would humans choose to become farmers, to work longer hours for worse nutrition, to accept political domination and economic inequality, to live in disease-ridden settlements where epidemics could kill half the population? The short answer is, they didn't choose it. Not consciously. Not all at once. What happened next was gradual, accidental, and ultimately irreversible. A slow-motion transformation that would change everything about human existence, for better and for worse, forever. And it all started with a simple observation. Some of the plants people gathered grew back where they had been harvested the year before, almost like they'd been planted. Almost like someone could make them grow on purpose. So here's the thing about the agricultural revolution. It wasn't a revolution at all. Nobody woke up one morning and decided, you know what? Let's invent farming today and completely transform human civilization. That's not how it happened. The transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture was so gradual, so incremental, that the people living through it probably didn't even realize they were participating in the most significant transformation in human history. Around 12,000 years ago, something began changing in the climate. The last ice age, which had dominated the planet for over 100,000 years, was finally ending. Not suddenly, not everywhere at once, but slowly, predictably, year by year. The massive ice sheets that had covered much of Europe and North America began retreating. Temperatures rose, rainfall patterns shifted, and in a crescent-shaped region stretching from the Persian Gulf through modern-day Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, and into southern Turkey, something remarkable happened. This region, which we now call the Fertile Crescent, found itself in what climatologists call the Goldilocks zone. Not too hot, not too cold, not too wet, not too dry, just right. The warming climate brought reliable seasonal rains. The retreating glaciers left behind rich, fertile soils, And most importantly, this region was home to the wild ancestors of many of the world's most important food crops. Wild wheat grew in vast stands across the hillsides. Wild barley carpeted the valleys. Wild lentils, peas, and chickpeas thrived in the rocky soils. These weren't the domesticated crops we know today. They were smaller, harder to harvest, more scattered. But they were abundant, and they were predictable. Year after year, these wild grains would ripen at the same time in the same places. For the hunter-gatherers living in this region, this abundance was a game changer. Remember, these were people whose ancestors had spent hundreds of thousands of years moving constantly, following game animals, searching for seasonal plant foods, never staying in one place for long. But here, in the Fertile Crescent, there was suddenly a reason to stay. Why move when food comes to you? The first changes were subtle. Groups that had previously migrated through the region began spending more time in the areas where wild grains were most abundant. Instead of passing through during the harvest season and moving on, they started staying for months, then seasons, then years. They built more permanent shelters, not just temporary lean-tos, but round stone structures with plastered floors. Archaeological sites from this period show the first real villages, places with 20, 30, maybe 50 people living together year-round. But here's what's crucial to understand. These people weren't farming yet. They were still hunter-gatherers. They were just hunter-gatherers who had found such a reliable food source that they didn't need to move anymore. Archaeologists call this the Natufian culture, named after the Wadi Natuf cave in Israel where it was first identified. The Natufians lived in permanent villages, but they were harvesting wild plants, not cultivated ones, and they were harvesting a lot of them. Archaeological sites show massive stone mortars for grinding grain, storage pits lined with plaster, even the earliest evidence of beer making. These people had figured out how to process wild grains so efficiently that they could support permanent settlements of unprecedented size. But they were still gathering, not growing. Then something happened. Nobody knows exactly what triggered it, but around 10,000 years ago, the climate in the Fertile Crescent became more variable. The reliable rains that had supported those vast stands of wild grains became less predictable. Some years were good, some years were terrible, and the Natufian villages, which had grown dependent on wild grain harvests, faced a crisis. This is where the story gets interesting, because instead of abandoning their villages and going back to a fully nomadic lifestyle, these people did something unprecedented. They started trying to manage the plants they depended on. They noticed that grains growing near the village were bigger than those growing in the wild. They noticed that certain plants produced more seeds than others. Most importantly, they noticed that if they scattered some of their harvested seeds on the disturbed ground near their settlements, plants would grow there the next year. This wasn't a conscious decision to invent agriculture. This was desperate problem-solving by people who had become dependent on a resource that was failing them. They were just trying to increase their odds of survival, but in doing so, they triggered a process that would transform both the plants and themselves in ways they never could have imagined. Because here's the thing about plant domestication. It's actually a process of mutual evolution. As humans started favoring certain plants, protecting them, replanting their seeds, those plants began changing. Wild wheat has seeds that shatter easily when ripe, scattering them on the ground. This is great for the plant's reproduction in the wild, terrible for humans trying to harvest it. But occasionally random genetic mutations would produce plants whose seeds didn't shatter. In the wild, these mutants would be at a disadvantage. Their seeds would stay on the stalk and eventually rot. But in a human-managed environment, these mutants subtly became advantageous. Humans could harvest them more easily, so they would save more of their seeds for replanting. Within just a few generations, the proportion of non-shattering plants near human settlements increased dramatically. The plants were being domesticated, transformed by human selection pressure from their wild forms into something new, something dependent on humans for reproduction, something that couldn't survive without cultivation. And it happened fast. Archaeological evidence shows that within just 2,000 years, the wild grains growing near Fertile Crescent settlements had been completely transformed into domesticated crops. Their seeds were larger, their stalks were tougher, their entire reproductive strategy had been rewired to depend on human intervention. But while this was happening, the humans were changing too. Groups that had started cultivating plants found they could support larger populations. More food meant more children surviving to adulthood. But it also meant more mouths to feed, which meant more land needed to be cleared and planted, which meant even less time for hunting and gathering. They were being domesticated by their crops just as surely as the crops were being domesticated by them. And here's the really wild part. This same process was happening independently in at least 6 other places around the world at roughly the same time. In the Yellow River Valley of northern China, people were domesticating millet and rice. In Mesoamerica, they were transforming a wild grass called teosinte into corn, beans, and squash. In the Andes, they were cultivating potatoes and quinoa. In sub-Saharan Africa, they were domesticating sorghum and yams. In New Guinea, they were developing banana and taro cultivation. None of these groups knew about the others. They weren't copying ideas or sharing technologies. They were all independently discovering that they could manipulate their local plant species to produce more food. The climate changes that ended the Ice Age created similar conditions in multiple regions around the world. Regions where wild plant foods were abundant enough to support permanent settlements, but variable enough to create pressure for human management. This wasn't inevitable. Not every region developed agriculture. Australia had been inhabited for 65,000 years and never developed systematic farming. Neither did large parts of North America, Southern Africa, or Northern Europe. The conditions had to be just right. The right climate, the right suite of domesticable plants and animals, the right population density to create pressure for increased food production. But where those conditions existed, the transition was remarkably similar. First, increased sedentism, people settling down near abundant wild food sources. Then, simple management of wild plants, clearing competing vegetation, maybe some light weeding. Then, saving and replanting seeds. Then, true cultivation with deliberate planting in prepared soil. The whole process took thousands of years in most places. People living through it probably never realized they were changing from foragers to farmers. The changes were too gradual, too incremental. But there was a point of no return, a threshold beyond which societies couldn't easily go back. It came when populations had grown so large that the surrounding wild resources couldn't support them anymore. When villages had expanded into towns of thousands of people who couldn't possibly feed themselves through hunting and gathering. When the landscape had been so transformed by cultivation that the wild plants and animals had been displaced or destroyed. By the time people realized they were trapped, it was too late. The agricultural societies of the Fertile Crescent, China, and Mesoamerica had passed the threshold. Their populations had grown beyond the carrying capacity of wild resources. The skills needed for successful foraging had been lost over generations. The territories they would have needed for hunting and gathering had been claimed by neighboring agricultural societies. They were committed, stuck with a way of life that demanded constant labor, that created new vulnerabilities to crop failures and disease, that would eventually transform them physically and socially in ways their hunter-gatherer ancestors would have found horrifying. But they didn't know that yet. They just knew they needed to plant more fields, store more grain, have more children to work the land. The trap had been set, and humanity had walked right into it. So here's where the story gets uncomfortable. Because when we talk about the agricultural revolution as possibly being humanity's greatest mistake, we're not just being provocative. We're talking about something you can measure, something you can see in the bones. Literal physical evidence written in human skeletons that tell a story nobody wants to hear. Your ancestors who made the transition from hunting and gathering to farming, they shrank, not metaphorically, actually physically got smaller. The skeletal record is absolutely clear on this. Before agriculture, the average human male stood about 5'9", women about 5'5". These weren't exceptional individuals, this was the norm. Hunter-gatherers were tall, robust, with strong bone density and well-developed musculature. Then comes farming. Within just a few generations after populations adopt agriculture, average height drops dramatically. In the Near East, where we have some of the best data, men lost about 6 inches on average. Women lost about 5 inches. This wasn't just one population having a bad millennium. This pattern repeats everywhere agriculture appears. Greece, Turkey, the Americas, China. Every single time humans switch to farming, they get shorter. And here's the thing. Height isn't just about genetics. It's a remarkably sensitive indicator of nutritional quality during childhood. When kids get consistent, high-quality nutrition with adequate protein and diverse vitamins, they reach their genetic height potential. When they don't, they end up shorter. The height decrease after agriculture tells us something profound. Despite having more food available, despite the supposed security of farming, children were actually getting worse nutrition than their hunter-gatherer ancestors. But height was just the beginning. The real horror show starts when you look inside their mouths. Hunter-gatherer teeth are generally excellent. Strong enamel, minimal decay. Most adults keeping their teeth well into old age. Archaeological evidence from pre-agricultural populations shows cavity rates of maybe 1 to 5%. Then agriculture arrives, specifically grain-based agriculture, and everything changes. Cavities explode to 16, 20, sometimes 50% of all teeth examined. Abscesses become common. Tooth loss in young adults becomes routine instead of rare. Some agricultural populations show evidence that the average person had lost multiple teeth by age 30. What happened? Grains, especially when processed into porridge or bread, create an environment in your mouth that cavity-causing bacteria absolutely love. The starches break down into sugars. The sticky consistency clings to teeth. And early farmers were eating grain-based foods at almost every meal. Their mouths had become bacterial incubators. But dental problems weren't just painful and disfiguring, they were deadly. A bad tooth abscess can kill you through infection. Before modern antibiotics, a cavity that penetrated to the root could mean weeks of agonizing pain followed by sepsis and death. The skeletal record shows us individuals who died with massive jaw infections, their last days almost certainly spent in unbearable suffering, and the nutritional problems went far beyond just getting shorter. Farming populations were developing deficiencies that hunter-gatherers rarely experienced. Take iron deficiency anemia. The condition shows up in skeletal remains as porotic hyperostosis, a distinctive pitting and thickening of the skull bones. It's rare in hunter-gatherer populations, but in early farming communities, especially those dependent on grain-heavy diets, it becomes incredibly common. Some sites show 50 to 60% of individuals affected. Why? Because while grains provide calories, they're not particularly rich in bioavailable iron, and many grains contain compounds called phytates that actually block iron absorption. Hunter-gatherers eating diverse diets with regular meat consumption didn't have this problem. But farmers, especially poorer farmers who couldn't afford much meat, were chronically anemic. Low energy, weakened immune systems, increased susceptibility to disease. Vitamin deficiencies became routine. Vitamin D deficiency, causing rickets in children, shows up in skeletal remains from agricultural populations worldwide. Vitamin C deficiency, causing scurvy, becomes detectable in bone pathology. Even protein deficiency becomes visible. Hunter-gatherers with their varied diets of meat, fish, nuts, and wild plants had excellent nutrition. Farmers eating mostly wheat, rice, or corn were missing critical nutrients. The bones themselves tell another story, one of repetitive stress, endless labor, bodies breaking down under tasks they weren't designed for. Look at the skeletal remains of women from early farming villages. Their arm bones show distinctive patterns of stress, and sometimes actual damage from hours of daily grain grinding. Pushing heavy stone grinders back and forth, thousands of times every day. The motion leaves marks on the bones, creates areas of abnormal development, sometimes causes stress fractures that healed poorly. Their spines show compression damage, arthritis appearing in young adults, vertebrae wearing down from the constant stress of bending, lifting, carrying. Many skeletal remains show evidence of back problems that would have caused chronic pain throughout adult life. Men's skeletons from farming populations show similar patterns. Damage to knee and hip joints from the repetitive squatting of planting and weeding. Shoulder injuries from the endless labor of plowing and harvesting. By age 40, many farming men showed skeletal damage that would have meant constant pain during any physical activity, and agriculture is nothing but physical activity. Compare this to hunter-gatherer remains from the same time periods. Yes, they have injuries. Hunting is dangerous, but the pattern is different. Acute trauma, broken bones that healed, occasional predator attacks. What you don't see is the chronic grinding damage of repetitive stress, the wearing down of bodies by the same motion performed 10,000 times. Then there's the children. This is where the story becomes almost unbearable. Infant and child mortality skyrockets in agricultural populations. Cemetery evidence from early farming villages shows death rates for children under 5 that would shock modern sensibilities. Some populations lost 30, 40, sometimes 50% of children before age 5. This wasn't universal, wasn't constant, but it was common enough to show up repeatedly in the archaeological record. Part of this was disease, which we'll discuss more later, but part was simple malnutrition. Farming populations were having more children. Yes, the settled lifestyle and reliable food supply meant women could have babies more frequently, but they couldn't always feed them adequately. Breast milk was being supplemented earlier with grain porridges that didn't provide complete nutrition. Weaning was happening earlier. Children were growing up malnourished. The skeletal evidence is heartbreaking. Small bodies showing growth, arrest lines in their bones, literal marks where growth stopped temporarily during periods of severe nutritional stress or illness. children's bones showing evidence of anemia, vitamin deficiencies, developmental problems. This was preventable suffering. Hunter-gatherer children, though fewer in number, generally showed much healthier bone development. Life expectancy itself became complicated. Now, averages are tricky here because high infant mortality drags down the numbers. But even when you control for childhood deaths, early farmers weren't living as long as hunter-gatherers. The combination of harder labor, worse nutrition, and increased disease meant that people who survived childhood often didn't live as long as their foraging ancestors. Hunter-gatherer remains from favorable environments show people living into their 60s and 70s with surprising frequency. Old age wasn't rare. It was a normal part of life. But in many early farming populations, making it to 50 was an achievement. Making it to 60 was exceptional, and the quality of those years declined. Hunter-gatherers who reached old age were often relatively healthy, still capable of contributing to their communities. But farmers? The skeletal evidence shows old age filled with arthritis, bone degeneration, dental problems, chronic pain from old injuries that never healed properly. The bone density measurements tell their own story. Hunter-gatherer skeletons generally show excellent bone density, strong cortical bone, well-developed muscle attachments. These were people who were physically active, well-nourished, using their bodies as they evolved to be used. Farming populations show declining bone density, especially in women. Osteoporosis becomes detectable in skeletal remains, weakened bones, increased fracture rates. This makes sense when you consider the lifestyle changes. Hunter-gatherers walked constantly, climbed, carried loads distributed across their whole bodies, used every muscle group regularly. Their bones responded by staying strong. Farmers did hard labor, yes, but often repetitive labor that stressed certain body parts while underusing others. And when nutrition was poor, their bones paid the price. The evidence isn't just from one region or one time period. This pattern repeats everywhere we have good skeletal data. China during the transition from foraging to rice agriculture. The Levant during the adoption of wheat and barley farming. Mesoamerica with the shift to corn-based agriculture. The Americas when indigenous populations adopted intensive cultivation. Sub-Saharan Africa during agricultural transitions. Different crops, different climates, different cultures, but the same physical decline shows up again and again. Shorter stature, worse dental health, more nutritional deficiencies, more skeletal stress indicators, higher infant mortality. Some regions show this more dramatically than others. Places where agriculture was most intensive, where populations became most dependent on a single crop, show the worst skeletal health. Populations that maintained more dietary diversity, that supplemented farming with hunting and gathering, show less dramatic declines. But the pattern is universal. Agriculture came with a physical cost. And here's what makes this so striking. In many cases, we can compare farming populations directly with contemporary hunter-gatherers. Not ancestors versus descendants, but people living at the same time in neighboring regions. One group farming, the other still foraging. The differences are stark. The foragers are taller, healthier, better nourished, with stronger bones and better teeth. The farmers have more food available, yes, more stored grain, more security against seasonal variation. But their borders are paying a price that no amount of stored wheat can compensate for. This wasn't a mystery to early researchers. When anthropologists first started systematically studying skeletal remains from agricultural transitions in the mid-20th century, the pattern shocked them. The assumption had always been that agriculture represented progress, improvement, better health. But the bones were telling a different story. Study after study confirmed it. Agriculture made people physically worse off, not immediately, not universally, but consistently enough that the pattern couldn't be ignored. So why did they keep farming? Why didn't people look at their deteriorating health, their shortened children, their painful bodies, and decide to go back to foraging? That's the trap we'll explore later. But for now, understand this. The transition to agriculture wasn't just a change in how humans got food. It was a fundamental transformation of the human body, and not in a good way. We became shorter, sicker, more prone to disease, more likely to die young, more likely to spend our lives in chronic pain. We traded the robust health of our foraging ancestors for the dubious security of stored grain. And once we made that trade, there was no going back. But if malnutrition, backbreaking labor, and shorter lifespans weren't enough, farming brought with it something that would change human existence in ways our ancestors could never have imagined. Something that would kill more people over the next 10,000 years than all the wars, famines, and natural disasters combined. Disease. Not just any disease, but epidemics, plagues, infections that could sweep through entire communities in weeks, killing half the population and leaving survivors traumatized and broken. Here's the thing about hunter-gatherers. They were, by our standards, remarkably healthy when it came to infectious disease. Sure, they died from injuries, from difficult childbirths, from the occasional infected wound. But epidemic disease, the kind that jumps from person to person, killing dozens or hundreds at a time, that barely existed in their world. And there's a simple reason why. They moved too much. Picture a typical hunter-gatherer band, maybe 25 to 40 people, constantly on the move. They spend a few weeks in one place, then pack up and travel to the next seasonal resource. They're never in contact with their own waste for very long. They're never breathing the same air as dozens of sick people crammed into enclosed spaces. Most importantly, they're never in groups large enough to sustain an epidemic. This is crucial to understand. Infectious diseases need a certain population size to survive. Take measles, for example. Measles is incredibly contagious, one of the most infectious diseases known to medicine. But it also burns through a population fast. People either die or recover and become immune within a couple of weeks. For measles to persist, it needs a constant supply of new, non-immune hosts. Epidemiologists have calculated that you need a population of at least 250,000 to 500,000 people, all living in relatively close contact, for measles to become endemic, meaning constantly present. Hunter-gatherer bands of 30 people scattered across vast territories. Measles couldn't survive. Smallpox couldn't survive. Cholera, typhoid, plague, all the diseases that would later devastate human civilizations. They couldn't get a foothold in mobile hunter-gatherer populations. Then humans decided to stay put. And everything changed. When your ancestors built those first permanent settlements, when they planted their first fields and committed to staying in one place year-round, they created exactly the conditions infectious diseases had been waiting for. Dense populations living in close proximity, check. Permanent structures where pathogens could persist, check. Contact with their own waste and contaminated water, check. And most devastatingly, close daily contact with animals, domesticated livestock that would become disease factories. This is where the real nightmare began. Because here's what nobody tells you about domestication. When you bring wild animals into your settlements, when you live with them day after day, Sleep near them, handle them, eat them, drink their milk. You're not just gaining food and labor, you're also gaining their diseases. Biologists call these zoonotic diseases infections that jump from animals to humans, and they're responsible for some of the deadliest plagues in human history. Measles came from cattle, smallpox, probably cattle again, or possibly camels. Influenza started in pigs and birds. The common cold, horses, tuberculosis, cattle, whooping cough. Pigs or dogs, we're not entirely sure. Think about that for a moment. Almost every major infectious disease that has plagued humanity for the last 10,000 years originated in the animals we domesticated. The very act of bringing animals into our communities created pathways for pathogens to make the jump to human hosts. Early farming villages were like epidemiological laboratories, places where humans and animals lived in unprecedented proximity, creating endless opportunities for disease transmission. You're milking your cow every morning, breathing the same air, getting microscopic droplets of bodily fluids on your hands. The cow has a respiratory infection, something that's no big deal for cattle. But the virus mutates, adapts, finds a way to infect human cells. Within weeks, half your village is coughing up blood. Or consider pigs. Archaeological evidence shows pigs were among the first animals domesticated, possibly because they were so useful. They'll eat anything, convert garbage into meat, thrive in the same environments humans prefer. Perfect, right? Except pigs are also incredibly similar to humans physiologically. Their immune systems work much like ours. Diseases that infect pigs can often make the jump to humans with minimal adaptation. The evidence from early farming settlements is horrifying. Skeletal remains from some of the earliest agricultural communities show infection rates that would have been unthinkable among hunter-gatherers. Tuberculosis shows up in bones from settlements in the Levant dating back 9,000 years. This is a disease that requires sustained close contact to spread, people living together in enclosed spaces, breathing recycled air, perfect conditions for TB bacteria to jump from host to host. Leprosy appears in the archaeological record around the same time. Another disease that requires prolonged close contact, that thrives in settled communities where people are living on top of each other, rarely moving, rarely getting the kind of exposure to sunlight and fresh air that might slow the bacteria's spread. But the zoonotic diseases, deadly as they were, weren't even the worst of it. Because early farmers created another set of conditions that proved equally catastrophic. They attracted rodents. Stored grain is a magnet for mice and rats. The archaeological record shows rodent populations exploding wherever humans started storing food. And rodents brought with them their own suite of diseases. Plague, the Black Death, the disease that would later kill a third of Europe's population, lives naturally in rodent populations. In nature, it rarely jumps to humans because wild rodents and humans don't typically share the same spaces. But pack grain into storage facilities, attract huge populations of mice and rats, have humans working in those same spaces daily, and you've created perfect conditions for plague to make the jump. Hantavirus, typhus, leptospirosis, all rodent-borne diseases that became common in early farming settlements. Villages built storage facilities that attracted rodents. Rodents contaminated food and water supplies with their waste. Humans consumed the contaminated materials and became infected. It's a cycle that still plagues us today, but it began when our ancestors decided to store surplus grain. Then there's the water situation, and this is where things get truly grim. Hunter-gatherers typically used water sources and then moved on. They weren't perfect environmentalists, but their mobility meant they rarely fouled their own water supply for very long. Farmers? Farmers were using the same water sources year after year, the same rivers and wells for drinking, washing, watering crops, disposing of waste. The contamination was inevitable. Early farming settlements had no concept of sanitation as we understand it. Human waste often ended up in or near water sources. Animal waste definitely did. The archaeological evidence from settlements in Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, early China, it all shows the same pattern. Dense populations living around limited water sources, using those sources for everything, creating perfect conditions for waterborne diseases. Cholera thrives in water contaminated with human waste. So does typhoid, dysentery, hepatitis A, giardia, and dozens of other intestinal infections. The skeletal remains of early farmers show evidence of chronic diarrheal disease, malnutrition consistent with repeated intestinal infections, growth stunting in children who survived multiple bouts of waterborne illness. Some early farming communities lost up to half their children before age 5, many of them to waterborne diseases that would have been virtually unknown to hunter-gatherers. And here's where everything compounds, because malnourished populations are much more susceptible to infectious disease. Remember, farmers were eating less diverse diets than hunter-gatherers, getting less protein, less vitamins, less of the micronutrients that support immune function. Their bodies were already stressed from constant labor. Many were borderline anemic from diets too dependent on grains. When disease arrived, their immune systems couldn't mount effective defenses. Hunter-gatherers, eating their diverse diet of wild game, fish, nuts, fruits, and vegetables, had robust immune systems. Not perfect, but functional. Early farmers, living on gruel and barely enough calories to fuel their constant labor, were immunocompromised by comparison. So when an epidemic did arrive, it spread like wildfire through populations that had no resistance and no resilience. The archaeological evidence shows repeated die-offs in early farming settlements, sudden reductions in population that can only be explained by epidemic disease. One year, a settlement of 500 people. The next year, maybe 200 survivors, burying the dead and trying to figure out what just happened. But here's what's really incredible in the worst possible sense. Our ancestors couldn't leave. The hunter-gatherers had the option to move away from disease outbreaks, to scatter and wait for infections to burn out. Farmers were trapped. They had fields that needed tending, grain stores they couldn't abandon, permanent structures they'd invested years of labor into building. So they stayed, generation after generation, enduring repeated epidemics, watching children die of diseases their nomadic ancestors never knew existed. And slowly, brutally, they adapted. Not culturally, at least not at first. Biologically, natural selection began favoring individuals with genetic variants that provided even slight resistance to common infections. The populations that survived were those whose immune systems learned to coexist with the constant barrage of pathogens. This is why, thousands of years later, when agricultural civilizations encountered isolated hunter-gatherer populations, the results were so catastrophic. The farmers had evolved immune systems battle-hardened by millennia of epidemic disease. The hunter-gatherers had not. Contact between the two groups often resulted in virgin soil epidemics, diseases sweeping through populations that had no genetic resistance whatsoever, killing up to 90% of those infected. But that was far in the future. For now, for those first farmers 10,000 years ago, disease was something new and terrifying. They were living in a disease ecology they'd created themselves, one that was actively selecting against them, killing their children, shortening their lives, adding yet another burden to an existence that was already harder than anything their hunter-gatherer ancestors had endured. The great irony is this: by creating civilization, by building settlements, and domesticating animals and storing surplus food, humanity also created the conditions for its own destruction. For the next 10,000 years, epidemic disease would be the greatest killer our species had ever known, surpassing even warfare and famine, all because we decided to farm. But the diseases weren't done evolving, and neither were we. Here's where the story gets really dark, because once you start storing grain, once you start accumulating surplus, you create something that hadn't existed in meaningful amounts for the previous 300,000 years of human history: wealth. And with wealth comes something we're still dealing with today: inequality. Hunter-gatherers couldn't accumulate wealth. Not really. Sure, one person might have a particularly nice stone knife or a special necklace of shells, but you can only carry so much when your entire life is spent walking. There's a built-in limit to material inequality. Plus, food went bad. You kill a deer, you share it with the group because it's going to rot anyway. There's no point hoarding meat that will be spoiled by tomorrow. This created what anthropologists call enforced egalitarianism. Not because hunter-gatherers were naturally more noble or sharing than us, but because the logistics of their lifestyle made significant inequality functionally impossible. But farmers changed everything, because grain doesn't go bad quickly. Store it properly, keep it dry and away from pests, and wheat or barley can last for years. Suddenly, for the first time in human history, you could accumulate resources far beyond your immediate needs. You could store the work of an entire season's harvest and still have it months or years later. This sounds great, right? Security, planning for the future, protection against bad years. And it was those things, but it was also the beginning of something else entirely, because not everyone accumulated surplus at the same rate. Some families had better land, slightly more fertile soil, better access to water, fewer problems with flooding or drought. Over a few seasons, these advantages compounded. Better land meant bigger harvests. Bigger harvests meant more seed grain for next year. More seed grain meant you could plant more fields. More fields meant bigger harvests. You can see where this is going. Within a few generations, some farming families were producing significantly more than others. And once you have more grain than you can eat, something remarkable happens. Grain becomes power. It becomes currency. It becomes the foundation of an entirely new kind of social organization. Archaeological evidence for this transformation shows up around 10,000 years ago in multiple locations. The earliest farming settlements show relatively uniform housing. Small mud brick structures, roughly the same size, clustered together with no obvious signs of hierarchy. Everyone appears to have lived more or less the same way. But by 8,000 years ago, things were changing fast. In settlements across the Fertile Crescent, archaeologists find dwellings of dramatically different sizes. Some houses are small, barely big enough for a nuclear family. Others are sprawling compounds with multiple rooms, storage facilities, courtyards. The differences are stark. Some families clearly had access to far more resources than others. The burial evidence is even more revealing. Early agricultural burials are remarkably uniform. Simple graves, minimal grave goods, everyone treated roughly the same in death. But by the time we get to established farming societies, burial practices tell a very different story. Some graves contain bodies adorned with elaborate jewelry, fine pottery, tools made from exotic materials traded from hundreds of miles away. Other graves are simple pits with nothing but the body itself. We're looking at the archaeological signature of inequality, the physical evidence that some people had vastly more wealth and status than others. So what happened? How did we go from relatively egalitarian hunter-gatherers to stratified agricultural societies in just a few thousand years? The answer lies in three interconnected revolutions: the creation of private property, the emergence of non-producing specialists, and the fundamental transformation of power relationships between individuals. Let's start with property. Hunter-gatherers don't really own land. They have territories they use, ranges they travel through. But the concept of exclusive ownership doesn't make much sense when you're moving constantly. You might return to the same valley every year, but you're not there long enough to build permanent structures or make lasting modifications. The land isn't owned. It's shared, used collectively by whatever group happens to be there. But farmers are different. Farmers invest enormous amounts of labor into specific plots of land. They clear the soil, remove rocks, build irrigation channels, plant crops that will take months to mature. This investment creates a psychological and practical shift. The land becomes theirs in a way it never was for hunter-gatherers. More importantly, that invested land becomes inheritable. When a farmer dies, their children inherit the fields the family has been working. Over generations, some families accumulate more and better land, while others end up with less productive plots or no land at all. This is the birth of private property as we understand it. The idea that specific resources can be owned by individuals or families and passed down through generations. It seems obvious to us now, but it represented a revolutionary change in human social organization. With private property came something even more consequential: the ability to trade land and surplus for labor. If your family has accumulated significant surplus grain, you can do something unprecedented in human history. You can feed people who aren't producing food. This is absolutely crucial. This is the moment when human society fundamentally transforms. Because once you can support non-food producers, you can have specialists, people whose entire existence is devoted to activities other than farming. The first specialists were probably fairly straightforward. Skilled craftspeople making pottery, tools, textiles. These were valuable services that farmers were willing to trade grain for. But soon the specialization became more elaborate. You get people whose job is to organize trade between communities, others who specialize in religious rituals, still others who focus on warfare and defense. And at the top, you get something humans had never really had before: an elite class. People whose entire existence is supported by the agricultural surplus of others, and who do no farming themselves. The evidence for this elite emergence is written in settlements from around 7,000 years ago. In places like Çatalhöyük in modern Turkey, we see the first clear signs of specialized leadership. Large buildings that served as administrative centers, storage facilities that collected and redistributed grain, evidence of trade networks that moved luxury goods hundreds of miles. Someone was organizing all this. Someone was making decisions about resource distribution. Someone had authority over others. And that someone was living very differently than the farmers who grew the grain that made it all possible. These early elites justified their position in various ways. Religious authority was particularly important. If you're the person who can communicate with the gods, who performs the rituals that supposedly ensure good harvests, you have power that doesn't depend on physical strength or even practical skills. Many early agricultural societies show evidence of powerful religious specialists who controlled significant resources. The temples weren't just places of worship. They were economic centers, repositories of surplus grain, hubs of redistribution networks. But the most dramatic social transformation brought by agriculture might have been in gender relations. Hunter-gatherer societies show relatively balanced gender dynamics in many cases. Women gather plant foods which often provide the majority of calories. Men hunt. Both activities are valued. Both genders have spheres of influence and autonomy. Archaeological evidence suggests fairly equal status in many hunter-gatherer cultures. But farming changed this equation dramatically, and the archaeological and anthropological evidence points to a troubling pattern. As societies became more agricultural, male dominance increased. The question is why? Several factors seem to be at play. First, agriculture is heavy labor. Plowing, clearing land, constructing irrigation works. These activities favor upper body strength, giving men advantages in the most critical agricultural tasks. Second, property inheritance becomes male-focused in many agricultural societies. Land and surplus pass from father to son, making male children more valuable in a way they hadn't been before. Third, and perhaps most importantly, women's reproductive capacity becomes economically significant. More children mean more laborers to work the fields. In agricultural societies, fertility transforms from a natural process to an economic asset. Women's bodies become sites of production in a new and troubling way. The archaeological evidence shows this transformation clearly. In early agricultural societies, female graves start showing less elaborate grave goods than male graves. Skeletal evidence suggests women were doing more grinding labor, processing grain for hours each day in ways that leave distinctive marks on bones. Evidence of violence against women increases. We start seeing defensive injuries on female skeletons that suggest domestic abuse was becoming common. This isn't universal. Some agricultural societies maintained relatively balanced gender relations. But the pattern is clear enough that most anthropologists agree. Agriculture was, in many places, a disaster for women's social status. The emergence of patriarchy, male control of property and political power, is intimately connected to the transition to farming. Then there's slavery. Hunter-gatherers don't really have slavery. There's no point. You can't force someone to hunt effectively. They'll just escape when you're not watching, or they'll sabotage the hunt. But farmers can be forced to work. You can literally chain someone to a field and force them to plant and harvest. This surplus they produce goes to you, not them. It's economically viable in a way slavery never was for hunter-gatherers. The first clear evidence of systematic slavery appears in agricultural societies around 6,000 years ago. We see mass graves of individuals showing signs of malnutrition and injury patterns consistent with heavy forced labor. We see shackles and restraints in archaeological contexts. We see artistic depictions showing bound captives engaged in agricultural work. Slavery wasn't just about conquered enemies. Debt bondage became common. If your harvest failed and you had to borrow grain to survive, you might end up working off that debt for years, effectively losing your freedom. In some societies, entire families could be enslaved for unpaid debts, creating hereditary bondage that lasted generations. This represents a level of systematic human exploitation that simply didn't exist before agriculture, and it was made possible by the same surplus accumulation that enabled civilization. Perhaps most tragically, farmers became trapped in a way hunter-gatherers never were. Once your family has invested years of labor into specific fields, once you've built permanent dwellings, once you've accumulated possessions too heavy to move easily, You're tied to that location. You can't just walk away when times get hard or when a more powerful group starts exploiting you. You're invested, stuck. This was the final revolution. Agriculture transformed humans from mobile populations that could respond to oppression by leaving, to sedentary communities that had to endure whatever their circumstances became. If a local strongman demanded half your harvest as tribute, you couldn't easily refuse or relocate. Your fields were here. Your tools were here. Your grain stores were here. You had to submit or fight, and fighting against organized groups with weapons and numbers was often hopeless. The archaeological record shows this trap closing. Early farming settlements show evidence of abandonment fairly frequently. People trying agriculture, finding it didn't work out, returning to more mobile lifestyles. But by 6,000 years ago, abandonment becomes rare. People stay even when conditions deteriorate, even when inequality becomes extreme, even when disease and violence make life desperately hard. They stay because they have no choice. The agricultural trap had closed. We were farmers now, for better or worse. And the social hierarchies born from stored grain and private property were here to stay. The world of chiefs and slaves, lords and peasants, the haves and have-nots. All of it growing from those first surplus harvests planted 12,000 years ago. But the story wasn't finished, because inequality and surplus were about to enable something else entirely. Something that would transform human existence even more dramatically than farming itself, civilization. But here's where things get really strange. And by strange, I mean completely counterintuitive. Because if farming made people sicker, shorter, and more prone to dying young, you'd think it would have been abandoned immediately, right? Our ancestors weren't stupid. If agriculture was such a disaster, why didn't they just go back to hunting and gathering? The answer is one of the cruelest paradoxes in human history. They couldn't go back. Not because they didn't want to, but because they had walked into a trap that closed behind them, and the mechanism of that trap was labor. Let's talk about working hours. Because this is where the myth of agricultural progress completely falls apart. Modern studies of surviving hunter-gatherer societies have revealed something shocking. Your average hunter-gatherer worked about 15 to 20 hours per week to meet all their basic needs, maybe 25 hours in harsh seasons or difficult environments, the rest of their time. Social activities, storytelling, art, play, rest. They worked less than a modern part-time employee at a coffee shop. Think about that for a moment. The people we've been calling primitive, the societies we assumed were constantly struggling to survive, they had more leisure time than almost anyone in the modern world. How is that possible? Because hunting and gathering, when you know what you're doing, is remarkably efficient. You don't need to work every day. Kill a large animal, and you've got food for a week. Find a productive nut grove or berry patch, and you can gather enough calories in a few hours to last days. The Kan people of the Kalahari, one of the most studied hunter-gatherer societies, obtained all their food needs with about 5 days of work per week. The rest was leisure. Now compare that to early farmers, dawn to dusk, every single day during planting season, every single day during harvest, hours bent over in the fields, pulling weeds, protecting crops from birds as rodents, hauling water during dry spells. Then there's the processing, threshing grain, grinding it into flour, preparing it for storage. This isn't 20 hours a week. This is 50, 60, maybe 70 hours of backbreaking labor. And we're not talking about varied, engaging work. Hunter-gatherers moved through diverse landscapes, used dozens of different skills, face new challenges every day. Tracking animals requires intense observation and problem solving. Identifying edible plants demands extensive knowledge. Every day brought different tasks, different environments, different challenges. Farming, you're doing the same motions over and over, bent at the waist, hands in the dirt, performing repetitive tasks that turn your body into a specialized machine, planting row after row, weeding the same fields, grinding grain with the same grinding motions that destroy your joints and spine. The archaeological record shows this clearly. Farmer skeletons don't just show malnutrition and disease, they show repetitive stress injuries, worn vertebrae from carrying heavy loads, damaged knee joints from kneeling in fields, arthritic hands from endless grinding. You traded the varied, intellectually engaging work of hunting and gathering for monotonous, physically destructive agricultural labor. And you worked twice as many hours doing it. So why make that trade? Here's where the trap mechanism kicks in. Because farming had one overwhelming advantage over hunting and gathering. It could support more people per square mile, a lot more people. A territory that might support 20 hunter-gatherers could support 200 farmers, maybe more if you really pushed it. This seems like a good thing at first. More food means more people can survive, right? But here's the cruel mathematics of the agricultural trap. More food doesn't actually make anyone better off. It just makes more people. When you start farming, yields increase. For a generation, maybe two, life actually improves. There's surplus food. Populations that have been stable for thousands of years suddenly start growing. Children who would have died in hunter-gatherer societies survive to adulthood. Families that would have had 3 or 4 children have 6 or 7. This seems like success. But remember, you're still farming with Neolithic technology. You can increase food production by clearing more land and working longer hours, but there are limits. Eventually, your population grows to match your food production. And then something terrible happens. You've got 200 people dependent on those fields instead of 20, and those 200 people need every single grain you produce just to barely survive. Now try going back to hunting and gathering. You can't. Those 200 people would need a territory 10 times larger than you have. And even if you had it, you've been farming for generations. You've forgotten how to track animals effectively. You don't know which wild plants are edible anymore. You've lost the skills that kept your ancestors alive for hundreds of thousands of years. You're trapped. You have to keep farming. In fact, you have to work even harder because your population keeps growing. Every generation faces the same calculation. Work more hours, clear more land, push yields higher, or watch your children starve. So you work more, and the population grows more, and the trap tightens. This is what anthropologists call the population pressure paradox. Agricultural societies weren't more successful because they made people better off. They were successful because they could cram more suffering humans into the same space. Natural selection doesn't care if you're happy or healthy. It only cares if you reproduce. And farmers, despite their misery, reproduced faster than hunter-gatherers. But it gets worse, because farming isn't just more labor-intensive on average. It's desperately uneven in its labor demands and catastrophically vulnerable to failure. Hunter-gatherers faced relatively consistent workloads. Bad days and good days, sure, but the variation was manageable. Resources were diverse enough that failure in one area could be compensated by success in another. Farmers faced seasonal desperation. Planting season meant weeks of dawn to dusk labor. Everyone in the community, children included, working until exhaustion to get seeds into the ground before the rain stopped or the growing season passed. Miss that window, and everyone starves. Harvest was even worse. Everything had to be brought in quickly before weather destroyed it, or animals ate it. Again, the entire community working to exhaustion, racing against time and nature. One bad storm during harvest, and a year of work vanishes in an afternoon. And between these periods of frantic labor, you couldn't rest. Fields needed constant maintenance. Weeds competed with crops. Pests had to be controlled. Irrigation systems required maintenance. You were on a treadmill that never stopped. Worst of all was the famine risk. Hunter-gatherers faced food shortages, sure, but they were mobile. If resources declined in one area, they moved to another. They had dozens of fallback foods, alternative strategies, the flexibility to adapt. Farmers were locked in place. Your fields were your lifeline, but also your prison. A drought? You watch your crops wither and there's nothing you can do. Too much rain? Your grain rots in the field. A swarm of locusts? A season of crop disease? You're helpless, and you've got 200 people depending on those fields for survival. The archaeological record shows repeated episodes of mass starvation in early agricultural communities, entire villages dying during bad years. This almost never happened to hunter-gatherers because they had options. Farmers had commitment. And here's another cruel twist: specialization. Hunter-gatherers needed to know everything: plant identification, animal tracking, tool-making, navigation, weather prediction, social negotiation, storytelling, medicine. Every individual was a polymath, carrying an encyclopedia of survival knowledge. Farmers, you needed to know how to farm. That was it. All those other skills, the accumulated wisdom of hundreds of thousands of years, they atrophied. You became a specialist in repetitive agricultural labor, and specialization made you even more vulnerable. When the crops failed, you had no fallback skills. You couldn't just switch back to hunting because you'd forgotten how. Women bore an especially heavy burden in agricultural societies. In hunter-gatherer groups, women gathered plant foods, which typically provided 60 to 70% of the calories. It was critical work, but it was compatible with childcare. You could gather with children alongside you, take breaks to nurse, adjust your workload based on your physical condition. Farming was different. Fields were often distant from settlements. Work was constant and inflexible. Planting and harvest couldn't wait for pregnancy or nursing schedules. So women worked through pregnancies, returned to the fields days after giving birth, carried infants to the fields where they were exposed to sun and disease. And because farming could support larger populations, women in agricultural societies had more children. Hunter-gatherer women typically spaced births 3 to 4 years apart. Farming women, 2 years or less. More pregnancies, more childbirths, more children to care for, all while maintaining the same brutal agricultural work schedule. The skeletal evidence shows this clearly. Women's bones in early agricultural societies show even more stress markers than men's. They were working harder, bearing more children, and dying younger. So here's the terrible irony. Farming made individual lives worse. Shorter lifespans, more disease, harder work, less leisure, greater vulnerability to famine, less personal freedom. For thousands of years, every measurable quality of life indicator declined. But farming populations grew faster than hunter-gatherer populations, and in the brutal mathematics of history, numbers win. A village of 200 sick, overworked, malnourished farmers could outcompete a band of 20 healthy, well-fed hunter-gatherers simply through weight of numbers. When the two groups came into conflict over territory, the farmers won. not because they were stronger or smarter or better adapted, because there were more of them. And once that process started, it was irreversible. Farming populations expanded, pushing hunter-gatherers into marginal territories. As farmland spread, wild game declined. The territories needed to support hunting and gathering lifestyles shrank. Hunter-gatherers either adopted farming themselves or were pushed to the edges of the habitable world. By 2,000 years ago, most of the planet's prime agricultural land had been converted to farming. Hunter-gatherers survived only in deserts, Arctic regions, dense rainforests, places where agriculture wasn't viable. And even there, they were living on borrowed time. The trap had closed completely. Humanity had traded freedom, health, and leisure for population density. We'd become the most numerous large mammal on Earth, and all it cost was everything that had made our ancestors' lives worth living. But we couldn't go back. The trap worked because it was irreversible. Each generation inherited a world more dependent on agriculture, more crowded, with fewer alternatives. The decision to plant those first seeds 12,000 years ago had committed every generation afterward to a path they couldn't escape. We'd worked harder to live worse, and we called it progress. But here's where we need to pause and acknowledge something crucial. Everything we've discussed so far makes farming sound like a complete disaster. Shorter lifespans, worse nutrition, new diseases, crushing inequality, harder work. If you're listening to this thinking, so why the hell did we stick with it? You're asking exactly the right question. Because despite all the suffering, despite all the cost we've cataloged, farming gave us something that hunter-gatherers could never achieve. It gave us numbers. Raw, overwhelming, civilization-building population density. Think about this. A typical hunter-gatherer territory might support one person per square mile, maybe 5 if you're in a particularly rich area with abundant game and edible plants. But a farming settlement, even early, inefficient farming, could support 50, 100, even 200 people per square mile. That's not just a marginal improvement. That's a completely different kind of human existence. By 4000 BCE, just 6,000 years after farming began spreading from its origin points, the global human population had exploded to somewhere between 5 and 10 million people. For context, during the entire Paleolithic era, the total human population probably never exceeded 5 million at any one time. Farming didn't just change how we lived. It fundamentally transformed how many of us could exist on this planet. And with those numbers came something unprecedented. Surplus. Not just enough food to survive, but extra. More grain than you needed for this season. More livestock than you could consume this year. Surplus changes everything. It's the foundation of every complex development that followed. Because here's what happens when you have surplus. Not everyone needs to spend their entire day finding food. For the first time in human history, some people could specialize. One person could spend their whole life becoming really, really good at making pottery. Not just functional cooking vessels, but refined, beautiful ceramics. Another could focus entirely on metalworking, experimenting with different ores and temperatures, discovering bronze, then iron, then steel. The archaeological record from early farming settlements shows this specialization emerging within just a few generations. At Çatalhöyük in Turkey, one of the earliest large farming communities dating to 7,500 BCE, researchers have identified distinct craft workshops, specialized areas for tool making, textile production, bead manufacturing. These weren't just people dabbling in crafts during spare moments. These were full-time specialists whose food was provided by the surplus production of their neighbors, and specialization breeds innovation. When someone can dedicate their entire life to a single craft, they get incredibly good at it. They discover techniques that would never occur to someone making pottery once in a while between hunting trips. They can experiment, fail, learn, and refine their methods over decades. This is how technology accelerates. A farming village in 6000 BCE had access to tools and technologies that would have seemed like magic to their hunter-gatherer ancestors just a few generations earlier. Fired pottery that could hold water and cook food more efficiently. Woven textiles far superior to animal hides. Polished stone tools with cutting edges sharper than anything achievable with simple chipping techniques. Metal implements that could hold an edge indefinitely. But the most important innovation that emerged from agricultural surplus wasn't a physical tool at all. It was writing. Around 3200 BCE in Mesopotamia, the first true writing system emerged. And it didn't develop for poetry or storytelling or religious texts. It developed because farmers and merchants needed to keep track of stuff. Picture this. You're a temple administrator in the city of Uruk, one of the world's first true cities. Thousands of people are bringing you grain as tribute. Hundreds of workers need to be paid in rations. You have to track planting schedules, harvest yields, debt obligations, land ownership. Trying to remember all this in your head is impossible. Even oral traditions and memory techniques have their limits. So you start making marks on clay tablets. Simple pictures at first. A stylized barley stalk to represent grain. A cow's head to represent cattle. Numbers represented by different-sized marks. This is proto-cuneiform, the grandfather of all writing systems. Within a few centuries, these simple pictures evolved into abstract symbols that could represent sounds, ideas, complex concepts. And once you have writing, everything changes. Knowledge no longer depends on human memory. Information can be stored, accumulated, transmitted across generations with perfect fidelity. A farmer in 2500 BCE could read planting instructions written by his grandfather 60 years earlier. A merchant could reference price records from decades past. A king could send detailed orders to governors hundreds of miles away. Writing led directly to mathematics. Those Mesopotamian accountants needed to calculate areas, volumes, quantities. They developed sophisticated arithmetic, including the first place value number system. By 2000 BCE, Babylonian mathematicians were solving quadratic equations and calculating square roots, not because they loved abstract math, but because managing agricultural surplus required it. The Egyptians took it further. They needed to calculate crop yields from fields of irregular shapes, to predict the flooding of the Nile, to design irrigation systems. This practical need drove the development of geometry. The word itself comes from Greek roots meaning earth measurement, math for managing farmland. But here's where it gets really interesting. Once these tools existed, once writing and mathematics were developed for boring, administrative purposes, humans started using them for everything else. Poetry, history, astronomy, philosophy. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of humanity's first great literary works, was written in cuneiform on clay tablets, the same writing system invented to track grain shipments. And with writing came the ability to accumulate knowledge across generations. A farmer could experiment with new techniques and write down what worked. His grandson could read those notes and build on them, trying variations, refining methods. Over centuries, this accumulation of agricultural knowledge transformed farming from a barely adequate survival strategy into an increasingly productive system. The same thing happened with architecture. Early farming settlements were simple, crude structures, but surplus meant some people could focus entirely on building. They experimented with different materials, different designs, different construction techniques. They learned that arches could span greater distances than simple beams, that certain mud brick proportions were stronger than others, that proper foundations prevented structures from collapsing. By 2500 BCE, just 7,500 years after the first farming settlements, humans were building structures that still inspire awe today. The Great Pyramid of Giza, constructed with over 2 million stone blocks, some weighing 80 tons, assembled with such precision that you can't fit a knife blade between the stones. This required advanced mathematics, sophisticated engineering, complex project management, and the ability to feed and organize tens of thousands of workers for decades. None of that happens without agricultural surplus. Hunter-gatherers don't build pyramids because they can't afford to have thousands of people not hunting and gathering for years at a time. The same principle applies to every other complex cultural achievement. Art flourished because some people could be full-time artists. Music evolved because musicians could dedicate their lives to their craft. Philosophy emerged because some individuals had the luxury of spending their days thinking about abstract questions rather than finding dinner. The Greek philosophers we still study today, Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, they weren't farmers. They were supported by an agricultural economy that produced enough surplus to feed people who contributed nothing to food production. The same is true for Buddhist monks, Hindu priests, Confucian scholars. Every major philosophical and religious tradition developed in agricultural societies with enough surplus to support people whose job was just to think. And sedentary life, that permanent attachment to one place that made farming possible, it enabled something else profound: accumulation. Hunter-gatherers have to carry everything they own. This puts strict limits on material culture. You only keep what's useful enough to justify lugging around for the next migration. But farmers don't move. They can accumulate possessions, tools, materials. More importantly, they can accumulate knowledge in physical form. Libraries become possible. Not just a few oral traditions passed down through generations, but vast collections of written texts, preserved indefinitely, accessible to anyone who can read. The Library of Alexandria, at its height in the 3rd century BCE, contained hundreds of thousands of scrolls, the accumulated wisdom of the ancient world. Greek science, Egyptian astronomy, Babylonian mathematics, Persian poetry, all in one place. This kind of knowledge concentration is impossible without agriculture, and that knowledge accumulation eventually led to the systematic investigation of the natural world. Science, in the modern sense, emerged from agricultural societies with enough surplus to support people whose only job was to figure out how things work. Ancient Greek natural philosophers, Chinese astronomers, Indian mathematicians, they were all products of agricultural surplus. Medical knowledge followed the same path. Hunter-gatherers knew medicinal plants and basic wound treatment. But complex medicine, surgery, anatomy, pharmacology, these developed in agricultural societies where specialists could dedicate their lives to understanding the human body. By 1000 BCE, Egyptian physicians were performing complex surgeries. Chinese doctors had developed sophisticated diagnostic techniques and herbal remedies. Indian healers had written detailed medical texts covering everything from childbirth to mental illness. Fast forward to today. Everything, And I mean everything about modern life traces back to agricultural surplus. The computer or phone you're using to watch this, the building you're sitting in, the clothes you're wearing, the medicine that keeps you alive when you get sick, the education that taught you to read and think critically, the art and music and literature that make life worth living. None of it, absolutely none of it, exists without farming creating enough surplus to free people from the daily struggle for food. Every scientist, engineer, artist, musician, writer, and philosopher in history was ultimately supported by farmers producing more food than they personally consumed. This is the trade-off we made 12,000 years ago. Individual humans became smaller, weaker, sicker, and worked harder. But collectively, humanity became capable of things that would have been literally unimaginable to our hunter-gatherer ancestors. We traded personal health for collective knowledge, individual freedom for civilization, easy living for accumulated wisdom, and here's the most important part. Once we made that trade, there was no going back. Once populations expanded to farming-supported levels, we couldn't return to hunting and gathering. There simply weren't enough wild resources to support the population densities that farming had enabled. We were locked in, committed to the agricultural path, whether we liked it or not. But that commitment, that inability to reverse course, it forced us to keep improving, to develop better tools, better techniques, better social organizations. Every challenge created by farming drove innovation to solve it. Not enough water? Develop irrigation, soil exhaustion, invent crop rotation, disease, create medicine, social conflict, develop laws and governments. The suffering was real, the costs were genuine, but the trade-off ultimately enabled everything that makes us distinctly human. Language existed before farming, but writing didn't. Art existed before farming, but monumental architecture didn't. Tool use existed before farming, but systematic technology development didn't. Social organization existed before farming, but complex civilization didn't. Was it worth it? That's not really a question we can answer because we didn't choose it individually. Our ancestors 12,000 years ago didn't vote on whether to adopt farming. They made incremental decisions that seemed reasonable at the time, and those decisions, accumulated over generations, transformed humanity in ways nobody could have predicted. But now, knowing the costs and the benefits, understanding the trade-off we made, we can ask a different question. What lessons does this hold for the choices we're making today? Because we're still making those trade-offs, still choosing between individual comfort and collective advancement, still creating systems that might look like mistakes to our descendants. So here we are, 10,000 years after the agricultural revolution began, sitting in climate-controlled rooms, staring at screens, eating foods our ancestors would barely recognize as edible. The descendants of those first farmers who planted wheat in the Fertile Crescent have conquered the planet. We've built cities that house tens of millions. We've split the atom and walked on the moon. We've increased our population from maybe 5 million at the dawn of agriculture to over 8 billion today. By any objective measure, farming was a spectacular success. And yet there's this nagging question that won't go away. Were we better off before? Was Jared Diamond right when he called agriculture the worst mistake in the history of the human race? Because here's the thing about modern life. We're living longer than ever, sure. We have access to medical care that would seem like magic to our ancestors. We have abundant food, entertainment, comfort. But we're also dealing with epidemic levels of chronic disease. Type 2 diabetes affects hundreds of millions globally. Heart disease kills more people than anything else in the developed world. Obesity rates have tripled since 1975. Depression and anxiety disorders are skyrocketing, and a growing number of researchers are asking, what if these aren't just random modern problems? What if they're the direct result of decisions made 10,000 years ago? Enters the paleo diet movement. You've probably heard of it. The basic idea is simple. Our bodies evolved for 2 million years to eat hunter-gatherer diet. Then, in just 10,000 years, we switched to agriculture-based eating. That's not enough time for significant evolutionary adaptation, so our bodies are still optimized for the old diet, and we're making ourselves sick by eating the new one. The paleo crowd says, cut out grains, dairy, and processed foods. Eat meat, fish, vegetables, fruits, nuts, and seeds. Basically, eat what your Paleolithic ancestors would have eaten, and magically the diseases of civilization will disappear. Now, is this totally accurate? Not exactly. Modern paleo diets are romanticized reconstructions that ignore huge amounts of regional variation in ancestral diets. Hunter-gatherers in different environments ate wildly different things. Some groups ate mostly meat. Others relied heavily on plant foods. Coastal populations ate seafood that inland groups never touched. There is no single paleo diet. Plus, the foods available today are nothing like what our ancestors ate. Modern vegetables are selectively bred to be larger, sweeter, and less bitter. Wild plants were much higher in fiber and defensive compounds. Even grass-fed beef from a modern farm is completely different from wild game meat. You can't really eat like a Paleolithic hunter-gatherer because those foods don't exist anymore. But here's what the paleo movement gets right. The agricultural diet did introduce foods our bodies weren't fully adapted to handle. The archaeological evidence is clear. When populations switched from hunting and gathering to farming, their health declined. We've already talked about the smaller statures, the worse teeth, the increased disease. That's not speculation. That's what the bones tell us. And we're still dealing with those consequences. Celiac disease, lactose intolerance, grain allergies. These are all evidence that some people's bodies never fully adapted to agricultural foods. They're carrying genetic variants that made perfect sense for hunter-gatherers, but cause problems in agricultural societies. Even for people without specific intolerances, there's mounting evidence that modern agricultural diets, especially highly processed versions, are contributing to chronic disease. High glycemic foods that spike blood sugar, seed oils that weren't part of the human diet until recently, ultra-processed foods that barely resemble anything our ancestors would have recognized. We're running Paleolithic software on an agricultural operating system, and the bugs are showing up everywhere. But here's where it gets really interesting, because the agricultural revolution isn't just ancient history. We're living through something remarkably similar right now, the technological revolution. Think about it. For 10,000 years, human life was organized around agriculture. You grew up in a farming community. You learned to plant and harvest crops. You worked with your hands in direct contact with soil and plants and animals. Your social world was face-to-face, embedded in tight-knit communities where everyone knew everyone else. Then, in just a few decades, everything changed. We moved from farms to factories to offices to remote work, from physical labor to knowledge work to staring at screens all day, from tight-knit communities to anonymous cities to social media networks of thousands of people we've never met. Sound familiar? It's the same pattern. A stable adaptive system that worked for millennia suddenly disrupted by new technology. Rapid change that promises benefits but also creates new problems, and a lag between the change and our ability to adapt to it. Just like agriculture, Technology offers undeniable advantages: information access, global communication, automation of tedious tasks, medical advances. Nobody wants to give up modern medicine or go back to hand-copying manuscripts. But also, like agriculture, technology is creating new problems we're only beginning to understand. Screen addiction, social media anxiety, the loss of deep face-to-face relationships, sedentary lifestyles, the erosion of privacy, the spread of misinformation at unprecedented speed. We're experiencing what those first farmers experienced: the cognitive dissonance of knowing that the new system has serious costs, while also recognizing that there's no going back. Because that's the real lesson of the agricultural revolution. Once a transformation reaches critical mass, reversal becomes impossible. Those early farming communities couldn't just decide to go back to hunting and gathering. They'd changed the landscape too much. The wild game was gone. The population was too large to support with foraging. The knowledge of wild plant processing was being lost. The social structures that enabled hunter-gatherer life had been replaced by something else entirely. They were locked in. They'd passed what systems theorists call a point of no return, and we're locked in too. Even if we wanted to return to pre-agricultural life, which would mean accepting mass starvation, we couldn't. The world has been too transformed. There aren't enough wild animals or wild plants to support 8 billion hunter-gatherers. The land has been converted to farms and cities. The knowledge has been lost. Same with technology. We can't just unplug the internet and go back to 1950. The global economy depends on instant communication. Modern medicine requires sophisticated information systems. The population is too large and too urban to survive without technological infrastructure. We're committed. For better and worse, we're riding this train to wherever it's going. But here's the thing. Just because we can't reverse course doesn't mean we can't steer. The agricultural revolution was a blind process. Those first farmers had no idea they were triggering a transformation that would reshape human life. They were just trying to get through next winter. They couldn't anticipate the disease burdens, the inequality, the labor trap. We're different. We can see what's happening. We can study the costs and benefits. We can make conscious choices about how to shape the technological future. That's what the paleo diet movement is really about, whether its advocates realize it or not. It's not actually about eating like a caveman. It's about asking, which parts of modernity are making us sick? And can we modify them without giving up the benefits? The answer seems to be yes sometimes. We can choose whole foods over processed ones without abandoning agriculture. We can build walkable cities without giving up modern transportation. We can use technology mindfully without becoming slaves to it. The key is recognizing that progress and well-being aren't the same thing. This is the fundamental confusion at the heart of the agricultural debate. Farming allowed civilization to progress. It enabled cities, writing, science, art, all the things we value about human culture. But it didn't necessarily make individual lives better or easier or healthier. The same is true for technology. It's enabling unprecedented progress in science, medicine, global cooperation. But it's not clear that it's making individual humans happier or healthier or more fulfilled. We're caught in the same trap that caught the first farmers. The collective trajectory and individual well-being pulling in different directions. What's good for civilization isn't always good for the individual people living in it. Ancient farmers worked harder, died younger, suffered more disease, but they fed larger populations and built the foundations of modern civilization. Modern workers stare at screens until their eyes hurt, deal with unprecedented levels of anxiety and depression, struggle with work-life balance. But we're advancing knowledge, and building the foundations of whatever comes next. The question is, can we do better this time? Can we build a future that serves both collective progress and individual flourishing? Or are we doomed to repeat the pattern, sacrificing well-being for advancement, generation after generation? Maybe the answer lies in recognizing what we're actually optimizing for. The agricultural revolution optimized for calories per acre. It was wildly successful at producing food energy. The fact that it made life worse in many other ways was, from an evolutionary perspective, irrelevant. The societies that adopted farming outcompeted and replaced those that didn't. Success was defined by survival and reproduction, not happiness or health. We have the option to choose different metrics. We can optimize for human flourishing, not just economic output. We can measure success by well-being, not just GDP. We can build systems that serve human needs as we actually experience them, not just what looks good on paper. But that requires being honest about the trade-offs. Being willing to say, maybe we don't need to maximize productivity in every domain. Maybe some inefficiency is worth it if it makes life more livable. Maybe faster isn't always better. The agricultural revolution teaches us that once you start down a path, inertia and interdependence make it nearly impossible to turn back. But it also teaches us that the initial direction matters enormously. The choices made by those first farmers, whether deliberate or accidental, shaped life for all the millennia that followed. We're making those kinds of choices right now, about artificial intelligence, about social media, about genetic engineering and climate intervention, and space colonization. Choices that will echo for thousands of years, shaping the lives of people who haven't been born yet. Will they look back at us the way we look at those first farmers, grateful for the foundations we laid, but also wondering why we didn't see the costs, why we didn't make different choices when we still could? Or will we be the generation that learned from history, the ones who figured out how to steer the transformation, instead of just being swept along by it? Because here's the final lesson. The agricultural revolution wasn't a mistake. It was inevitable. Given the climate, the available technology, the population pressures, farming was going to happen. And it was going to reshape human life completely. But how it happened mattered. The specific choices made by specific people at specific times created the particular version of agricultural society we ended up with. Different choices would have created different outcomes. Not perfect ones, but different ones. We're in the same position. The technological transformation is inevitable. We're not going back. But the future is still being written, and we're the ones holding the pen. The question isn't, was farming worth it? That's unanswerable. It happened. We're here. We are the product of that 10,000-year experiment in living differently. The question is, what are we going to do with the lesson? So here we are. After tracking humanity's journey from mobile hunter-gatherers to settled farmers, after examining the broken teeth, the shrunken bodies, the diseases and inequalities that agriculture brought with it, we're left with a question that doesn't have a comfortable answer. Was farming really the greatest mistake in human history? Here's the paradox that makes this question so difficult. On an individual level, for most people, for most of history, the answer's probably yes. The average farmer worked harder, ate worse, died younger, and suffered more than their hunter-gatherer ancestors. They were trapped in a system that demanded endless labor and gave back only enough to keep them alive. Their bodies were destroyed by repetitive strain. Their children died from diseases that wouldn't have existed in smaller mobile populations. They lived under hierarchies that concentrated resources and power in fewer and fewer hands. But zoom out, look at the species level instead of the individual level, and suddenly the picture changes completely. Without farming, there's no surplus. Without surplus, there's no specialists, no craftspeople dedicating their lives to mastering metalwork or pottery, no priests or scribes preserving knowledge across generations, no engineers designing irrigation systems or architects planning cities. Without farming, there's no civilization, no written language to transmit ideas across centuries, no accumulated knowledge that could be built upon generation after generation, no mathematics, no astronomy, no philosophy, no art beyond what could be carried on a nomadic journey. Without farming, there's no technology complex enough to eventually create antibiotics, vaccines, modern surgery. No infrastructure to support the billions of people alive today. No you, probably. No me, definitely. Our bloodlines would have vanished during one of 1,000 population crashes that small hunter-gatherer bands faced throughout history. So was it a mistake? That depends on what you're measuring. Quality of life versus quantity of life. Individual happiness versus species survival. Freedom versus security. There's no objective way to weigh these things against each other. But here's what we can say with certainty. Once it started, there was no going back. That's the truly remarkable thing about the agricultural revolution. It wasn't something our ancestors chose with full knowledge of the consequences. Nobody sat down and calculated the costs and benefits, deciding that yes, shorter lives and harder work were worth it for the possibility of civilization millennia in the future. They just responded to immediate pressures. A village that produced more food could support more children. Those children grew up and needed more food, so the village cleared more land and planted more crops. Neighboring groups saw the larger populations and adopted farming themselves to compete. Anyone who tried to return to hunting and gathering found the wild spaces already occupied or the game already depleted. It was a ratchet that only turned one direction. Each step seemed small, reasonable, even beneficial. But collectively, those steps led somewhere nobody would have chosen to go if they could have seen the destination. We're all living with the consequences of decisions made 10,000 years ago by people who had no idea what they were starting. Decisions that were neither mistakes nor triumphs, but simply adaptations to changing circumstances, responses to problems that seemed important at the time. And maybe that's the real lesson here. The things that change history aren't usually grand choices between obvious alternatives. They're small adjustments, incremental shifts, practical responses to immediate problems. We don't get to see the long-term consequences of our decisions until it's far too late to change them. So as you're drifting off to sleep tonight, maybe think about the journey we've traced together. From those tiny groups of humans scattered across Africa, surviving against impossible odds, through the bottleneck that nearly ended our species before it truly began, to the explosive expansion that followed, spreading human populations across the world, and finally to those first farmers planting seeds that would grow into the modern world. They didn't know they were making history. They were just trying to survive, to feed their children, to make it through one more harvest season. And that's what humanity has always been. Not heroes or villains, not making triumphs or mistakes, just survivors, adapting to whatever the world throws at us, creating the future one small decision at a time. If you've made it this far, I hope you've enjoyed this journey through deep history. If you did, leave a like on this video, subscribe if you want more history designed to help you drift into peaceful sleep, and drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from tonight. Are you in a city that wouldn't exist without agriculture? Or somewhere the old wild world still remembers what it was like before the first seeds were planted. Sweet dreams, and remember, you're the product of survivors who made it through impossible odds. That's something worth sleeping peacefully about. Good night.